All right, welcome back to the program. You're watching M Live this morning as we take a look at some of the stories making headlines, as well as the second day of the state visit by the monarch, that is King Charles III and Queen Camilla here in the country, were received by President William Ruto yesterday at State House in Nairobi. Now, before we get into that, we're still looking at quick briefs on what's captured in the dailies, and this is an interesting one. Well, experts want Kenya Kwanza to curb insatiable tax appetite, is what is in the Daily Nation. The Kenya Kwanza administration coming under criticism over its fiscal policy proposals that heavily relies on taxation to raise revenue. Now, according to economic experts who appeared before the National Dialogue Committee sitting in Bomas of Kenya to discuss the high living costs, the situation is as a result of the government's unfavorable tax regime, they say. The roundtable meeting identified increased taxation, unrealistic budget and revenue estimates, and the lack of foreign direct investment as a contributor to the high cost of living. Now, the committee did hear from the Controller of Budget, Margaret Nyakango, the Institute of Economic Affairs Chief Executive Officer, Kwame Wino, and officials from the Parliamentary Budget Office as well. Now, the experts telling the committee, of course, co-chaired by leader of the National Assembly, that's the Majority Leader, Kimani Ichung'wah, and Wiper Party Leader, Kalonzo Musyoka, that the increased value-added tax and excise duty has had a huge negative impact on the economy, but by reducing Kenyans' spending power. According to the Control of Budget, the existing taxation structure overburdens low-income earners who are the majority in the country and is likely to worsen the current economic crisis. In fact, there's a report we did air yesterday. It was NTV's Sydney Chazima, who says the Control of Budget, Margaret Nyakango, has also lifted the lead on some controversial budgetary decisions undertaken by the government, which have contributed to the high cost of living. Nyakango claims that budgeted corruption is rampant in the government. And of course, this was when she appeared before the National Dialogue Committee, revealing that her salary was inflated 3 times. Let's have a look at that report. We'll be back. All right, so we're going to be getting that report by Sydney Chazima in a moment. It's a story that we aired yesterday after he went to cover that particular story before the National Dialogue Committee at the Bomas of Kenya. Let's just have a listen.
Critical issues at all.
As the National Dialogue Committee nears the tail end of its sittings, several economic experts made their submissions on how the skyrocketing cost of living.
All right, we apologize for that, but we can begin by just trying to analyze this particular story before we get that story by Sydney. Let me begin with you, Wakili. So there are a number of issues coming out of this, and it's interesting. I wanted you guys to listen to what the Controller of Budget had said in terms of what she termed as budgeted corruption, and then this issue where economic experts are now giving their opinions, saying that the Kenya Kwanza administration has an insatiable tax appetite. Suleiman.
I think I would say that just before the election, when the current government was on a campaign platform, it did tell Kenyans that there are various alternative ways of raising the country's revenue without necessarily taxing Kenyans much more than they're already shouldering. And I think that that is what has caught my surprise, because every single day we end up seeing a new finance bill, an amendment to the existing finance law in the country trying to exert more and more taxes. When you have the likes of the Controller of Budget, the likes of Kwame Wino, the likes of officials from the Parliamentary Budget Office talking about what is happening in terms of increasing more burden on the shoulders of Kenyans, I think it is something that the government ought to take as a serious measure.
And I want you to hold on to that thought,
yes,
because I want you to continue after we have a look at this story to give us more context as well.
Issues at all.
As the National Dialogue Committee nears the tail end of its sittings, several economic experts made their submissions on how the skyrocketing cost of living can be lowered. The Controller of Budget, Margaret Nyakango, in her submissions, revealed some government measures she believes have led to the high cost of living, lifting the lead on deep-rooted economic blunders by the government.
Poverty.
One of the thorny issues raised lingered around budgeted corruption. Nyakango says that compensation from the Consolidated Fund Services for all state officers was exaggerated 3 times, raising questions whether the austerity measures the government says it has put in place will work.
I found out that my salary was budgeted at 3 times what I'm paid. So I asked them, why is the budget showing 3 times what my annual salary is? And it was like that for all the state officers.
What was the answer, madam?
Chairman, I have not received the answer to date.
According to the Control of Budget, there is a need to reduce deficit financing, which has necessitated over-borrowing by the Treasury.
We know that we are in a cash crunch, but this cash crunch ni ile ya kujitakia, because like I told you before, we have been borrowing and partying with borrowed money. That is why we are where we are.
The Control of Budget also faulted the government's move to increase taxes on basic commodities.
Looking at the prices of kerosene, the price of makaa, the price of cooking fuel generally is a really sore area because no one can do without it. The third thing I would be looking at is VAT on food. Now, when we introduce VAT on unga, a staple food, then you know the very lowly are going to suffer.
We thought it would only be fair.
The co-chairs of the Dialogue Committee, in their response, differed on the role of Parliament in addressing the high cost of living.
Kimani is Parliament and Wandai is Parliament. Is under capture, state capture. So you shouldn't expect much from them. And this is why we have to really go deep into these things.
We have been bold enough to deal with some of these issues touching on the economy. And I believe history will judge the 13th Assembly different from other assemblies of all the units that they so built.
On the Housing Fund levy, which has now contributed to the shrinking employees' payslip, the Control of Budget called on the government to ensure its success, appearing to call out the president over unfulfilled promises.
Now, what happens if every time you speak to someone, they do not keep their word? I think you will not be in a position to trust them the next time they speak. Why I'm saying this is that I keep my ears open a lot of times when people are arguing, my friends on the golf course and all that, and I hear them say, who tells you we'll get these houses?
Submissions over the implementation of the affordable housing program will be tabled on Wednesday. Sydney Chazima, NTV.
All right, yeah, Wakili Bashir, you can be able to continue. Interesting revelations there by the Control of Budget herself on really what she actually terms are parting with on, money that you've borrowed.
And I think I will say that she emerges as a very honest person. All of us are in this country, we can see what is happening in our country. When she tells you that her own salary has been budgeted for thrice what she's earning, look at the rot in the particular government that we are having in this republic. The person who is talking or who is addressing this particular committee is not the ordinary street walker, no. This is the Control of Budget, someone who is appreciative of certain facts about what happens in our country. And do you know the answer to that? It is exactly what the co-chair has said in terms of saying that the parliament of our country is under state capture. Do you remember that towards the election, our deputy president, the current deputy president, Mr. Honorable Gachagua, used to say that once we assume office, a state captured parliament will end. Actually, what we are having in this parliament is worse than what we have had before. The reason why I'm saying so is because every day we wake up, what we see is corruption. What we see are people who are being charged in court for corruption and bribery. No actions are being taken, especially even compared to the previous regimes. At least initially, in the previous regimes, we used to see certain government officials who plunder government resources, actions being taken against them. I'll tell you another thing. We're in a time whereby I'm in the panel of some county governments in this country. You will realize that whenever tenders are advertised, there's a side discussion in terms of saying that this is the actual figure, and this will be my figure on top of this particular budget that we're having. In other words, it is a corruption that has been actually persisted not just in the national government alone, but also in the county government. Every single day, I'm telling you, and what you're going to see even in the next few weeks is also another increase in terms of the pump prices of what we are charged in terms of our fuels. Every day we are waking up to increased taxation. Why? It is not because the government is lacking some revenue in terms of how to run this country. No, it is because there is more appetite in terms of having an extra budget on what to steal. You will find a country whereby the government, the head of the government, the deputy head of the government, and those particular ministers who are running our country are all thinking of what is the slight budget that I can put inside this particular thing for myself. And if we go that way in the next 4 to 3 years, I think the situation will be worse. What is the best thing to do? The best thing to do is for our parliament to wake up from its deep sleep. Also, what is important is also for the opposition, not just to say that the parliament is under state capture, we are the minority. No, at least there is a voice that they can do within the flow of that house. This particular presentation is being made before a committee. Some of these members are actually, one of them is the leader of minority. The other one is the leader of majority. And all they are doing is just to laugh about an entire government officer who is telling them, my salary has been budgeted for thrice, and they see that as a laughing matter. I think this country, you know, we used to try prayers, but prayers seem not to be working anymore. But I think now all we can pray for maybe are wonders, because the situation is worse. And I also like what he said. The controller of budget said, if you lie to people and you keep on lying to them, do you think they will believe you ultimately? And the answer is an outright no. And we are the ones to regret where we find ourselves in. All I'll say is the courts, in terms of the judiciary, which I happen to be part of in terms of the extra circle, is doing a lot in terms of trying to see some cases being prosecuted. Let the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution and the DCI try and do something in terms of having certain persons who are found within corruption malpractices taken, face the arrest. And I will also finally say that for us to fight what is called now the budgeted corruption thing, the person who should lead by example is the president and his deputy. What did we see on the papers the other day? Increased the budgetary allocation for the offices of their spouses in terms of the first lady and the deputy president's office. The wife to the deputy president. This tells us that these are the people who were even expecting them to lead by example in terms of curbing corruption, but it is the contrary of what we're expecting. So the situation is grim. To be honest with you, the situation is not so good in my view. And I think the institution that needs to learn, that needs to know who has the power, it is parliament. This institution has the power to remove the president where he behaves the way he's doing. But far from it, we can see one side of the opposition who are even thinking of how they are getting close, how they will find their way closer to the circle of the president.
All right.
And I think it's worrisome, to be honest.
I want to hear from Maliba on whether he found it a bit shocking on the statements that were made by the controller of budget yesterday before the committee.
Zainab, just before I respond to that, would you allow me to ask Bashir what he thinks Parliament should be removing the president for having done?
For being the master of corruption in this country.
Okay.
Is this an outright answer?
Okay.
By the way,
I wanted him to say that
all of us are in the country. We live in Kenya. We see what is happening. We see how much budgetary allocations are done. And actually, the only oversight.
Not the president who does the
you see, Zainab, the best oversight. That's why I'm saying it is our parliamentary budget committee that is being used to pass crucial legislations, crucial budgetary bills. But what I'm saying is, when you read the papers, as the fourth state in terms of seeing in terms of casting oversight on the government, we see what is splashed on the front pages of the papers in terms of telling us.
So you're saying Parliament should indict itself for
No. What I'm saying
budget?
is the government can be run without necessarily capturing Parliament. What is happening is there are people who are running this particular house. Just see how the Speaker manages the house. You will realize that when the Speaker was placed in that particular National Assembly, the whole agenda was to see that certain bills, whether good or bad, sail through that house. And when I tell you this, in the 11th Parliament, I worked in the Parliamentary Service Commission. I worked in the National Assembly. I'm privy to what happened within the 11th Parliament. I studied what happened in the 12th Parliament. I was expecting the 13th to be better,
so you're
but it is the worst.
Capture. All right.
So I wanted him to actually respond, and he's taken time to respond to that because so far I do not see anywhere where Parliament, there is anything called Parliament capture. There is no Parliament capture.
But we have had.
If there is any parliamentary capture, it is not by state. It is actually by greed. And he's actually said something that I actually wanted to mention, and it's good he's brought. You know, this conversation, a lot of times we raise these issues, and we are not ready to have this discussion as a country. If Bashir worked in Parliament, I have been there myself, he would know one thing, that Parliament cannot raise. The weakest link in our governance is Parliament. And when coming up with the Constitution 2010, we came up with the checks and balances, did away with the imperial presidency, and empowered Parliament with the hope that so many people cannot conspire against the nation. So, if you've worked in Parliament, you know that Parliament cannot, for example, question anybody on nepotism, on favoritism. Because if you were to look at parliamentary staff, they are simply spouses and children of former parliamentarians and members of Parliament.
But do you agree
it's much
that
more.
the independence of Parliament has been put
That's what I'm saying.
question?
It has not been captured by an outsider. It is a problem within. Let me tell you, if, for example, most of parliamentary staff are children and spouses of parliamentarians, did William Ruto do that? He didn't do that. Did it start today? It didn't start today. So you cannot pin that. Already, Parliament is defeated from within, not without. So we cannot push that issue. Parliamentary weaknesses should not be put to the executive. That is an issue that should be dealt within. But then do we want to have this conversation?
But isn't it the executives overpowering or domineering power
no?
on the legislature?
I asked a question. Does the executive tell parliamentarians and the people who work within that particular system to hire their spouses, their children, and everything else? If there is a place where it's actually full of people who work there, as in people talk about nepotism and everything else, it's within that. Does the executive do that? No. I needed to bring out this point and say this, that even as we talk about parliamentary capture, there is no state capture of Parliament. Parliament has been captured by greed, and there is an issue I have raised before and no one wants to talk about a lot of times, this thing called the National Government CDF. The National Government CDF is the biggest problem we have with Parliament. As in, it offends the Constitution, it has made our Parliament not to be parliamentarians. So you're going to have people, if you're complaining about traveling allowance, do you know the person you need to watch? Just go to Peter Salasia, Mumias East MP, see wherever he travels and see what he does. That is where the traveling allowance goes. That is what your MPs do elsewhere. So how, again, is the president, for example, to blame for that? And Parliament is not a late endorser to budget-making process. Parliament is a budget-making body. In the Constitution 2010, function number 4 for Parliament is budget-making. In the days of old, Parliament will come and endorse budget-making. They are now a budget-making body. So let us not blame the quality of the people we put in Parliament on the executive. William Ruto is supposed to run the executive. He cannot come again and start dealing with the people you chose and voted them for them overwhelmingly.
So, Arnold, are you saying the executive does not have any influence?
I will come to that. I will come to that. I'm talking about
how
systemic problems, first of all, before we run away from systemic issues. The other thing on the civil service, why do we have public service, whether at county and national level? You know, we cannot turn government into an employment bureau. 900,000 people consuming literally almost 90% of our ordinary revenue. As in, for every 10 shillings you contribute in taxes, 9 shillings is actually paying somebody in public service. That is not how you run government. But do you know how we change that? Are we ready to actually do away with permanent and pensionable and bring in contract? That is a conversation we are not willing to have. If you went to the US, you will realize that works. But if you are to bring that up here, you will be told how you actually want to finish people. As Nyakango actually says this, she's a veteran of public service. She knows that the biggest animal in the wage bill is this thing called allowances. Again, will you put that on the president? No. That is a systemic problem. Do you know how difficult it is to fire a civil servant? It is so difficult to hire. There are people who do nothing in this government. They come in, read newspapers, they sit in a corner, they are paid well, and they go home because no one wants them within that particular system, or they are no longer functional. But you can't send them away. So if we want to
blame for that?
You want to blame that on the president? No. Does the president make laws? No, he doesn't. We will go back to Parliament again. And that's why I'm telling you, the weakest link in our governance is not the executive. We can run around. We are not ready to have this particular conversation. The weakest link in our governance is Parliament. And somehow we got it wrong when we thought that if we gave power to so many people, they will not agree to conspire. What we forgot is that CDF became that unifying thing. That CDF will bring them together. It will be the easiest thing that can actually be used to guilt trip them and arrest them. So you will find a member of Parliament who's never spoken in Parliament telling people on the ground, as in, kwenda kupiga kelele bungeni ni kupiga kelele, so long as CDF is working well. We did not elect CDF managers.
But what is
so that's what I'm actually saying.
What is the root cause of that? Don't we see that perhaps there is this system with even the CDF
I will ask you a question.
This system of a political interest as well.
I will ask you the same question. What is the difference between this parliament and the last one? What is the difference between this parliament and the previous one? The only difference between this parliament and the previous one is that 67% of them came back, when initially 67% of them will go home. And how did these ones come back? They came back because they perfected the use of CDF. So long as CDF remains within Parliament's precincts, I can tell you we will have these conversations. Right. Legislation will not be taken seriously. Let me just finish. Legislation will not be taken seriously. People will not, so long as you can actually take care of your CDF well, you don't care about oversight. You don't care about representation. You don't care about legislation. You don't care about budget making. They come here, you have invited them on this seat. And when we are talking about budget, a budget document that has actually been to Parliament 3 times before it comes out here, and a member of Parliament who's supposed to be an insider doesn't know about it. You know that. So let us not keep on blaming the executive and the president on issues that, number one, are systemic, number two, are to be blamed on us because we elect these people who would rather go and dance out there and do all manner of stuff rather than do their damn job, and then we come here and have to pin it on somebody else.
All right,
Zainab, let me just quickly say this, that once we were through with the election, the first thing we realized was the president calling for meeting, one with the independent MPs. He had several meetings with them. The second thing he did was to also meet members of parliament who were in different political parties, who are not necessarily in ODM, even those who are within the affiliate of what was called the Azimio coalition. What was the agenda? The entire agenda was to ensure that he has a certain chunk of the support of these particular MPs in the House. He really understands the powers behind the game of numbers. Secondly, let us just look at who is the leader of majority. The leader of majority is Honorable Kimani Ichung'wah. We know his relationship with the president. We know who has actually placed him strategically in that particular position. Thirdly, let's just look at the finance committee chairperson. Who is he? Look at the chairperson of the budget committee. Who is he? Do you know the powers of these particular respective departmental committees? What happens in those particular committees and what they transact? The entire reason as to we have in certain particular political faces who are given crucial parliamentary positions in terms of committees is because they were to be used on the floor of that particular house, and they are doing that job right. When we say that it is not the president who is controlling the parliament or he has no influence over this parliament, it's like we are choosing to bury our heads in the sand. We are in this country. There's the textbook bit of the law, and there's a practical essence of it. What we can see in our country, in few words, is a parliament that is run from State House. Whether my colleague appreciates it or not.
Arnold, allow me to give Prof.
Because quickly in a minute, kindly. Number one, there is no sin in the president meeting parliamentarians. All government branches are interdependent. The president can't function without the legislature. There is no sin, it's not cosmic treason. That is normally how it works everywhere. So we cannot expect, and by the way, being in different formations is not enmity. And if you are a member of ODM and you have been elected, you are not an outsider, you are government. Because who pays members of parliament from wherever they come from? So that particular argument for me is nihilist because it denies the very functioning of how governments work. What I actually have said, the problems we have, number one, let us just accept that our parliament is weak. For two reasons. Number one, systemic. Number three, the quality of the people we elect and take to parliament. And the issue we don't want to talk about is that CDF is actually the killer of the legislature, as it were. I have actually done a paper on that, and I will tell you one thing. All these noises we make about parliament not doing its work properly, if you did away with CDF, Babu Wino would be lethal in that parliament. But you see, if he can play around with CDF, for example, I'm giving an example. Babu is my friend. So if he can play around with CDF and give it probably to the people who support him, the next time Babu wants to open up his mouth probably and become so lethal, you can remind him, we will take you to the police. Okay. The same will happen to another person. Then you're going to have these members of parliament who know nothing about being a member of parliament. They know nothing with the representation. They know nothing with the legislature. They know nothing on what they're supposed to do, but they know one thing that they do so well. They are very good CDF managers. They will tell you that in law, they have nothing on CDF. But when an MP dies, you reconstitute the CDF. committee. How are you reconstituting it if he has nothing in law on it or in fact?
But Arnold, you know, you've shifted the whole spotlight on Parliament. When you have Nyakango saying you already have the existing taxing structure, which implements a policy by the government, the current administration, the executive, that is overburdening low-income earners or majority in the country.
In that question...
Let me get to Prof, then I give you an opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm sure Prof agrees with me largely.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure, but let's
Thank you very much, Zainab and the team for your discussion. I want to state that I'm a governance expert and an economist. And I will allow me to make the following submission. They have had a very long day. First of all, responding to the fact that he says that we have a government that promises something that doesn't do. As a governance expert, there's a risk when a government doesn't do what it does. A government has what's called a going concern. That's why a government can sign a deal with you when one head of state will retire tomorrow, knowing that even the person coming will execute it. When the government makes pronouncements, we are going to invest in affordable housing, people can now start training children to prepare to work in that sector. People can now start investing in that sector. But if a government says, we are doing this, yet they don't do, then it even kills what they call private sector trust in the economy. Because whenever government make pronouncements called policy statements, the private sector responds to it, the citizens respond to it. And if they make them and they don't do them, it's a serious damage. Because that's why people say doing business with government is one of the most secure business, risk-free business. So I would like to ask the president that please, let us bring back decorum into government, where what the government says does. It was a big mistake when Uhuru Kenyatta said that the Agenda 4. Then he said again on television that Agenda 4 has failed. That was a very, very painful statement made by the head of state, because normally when the president says this and he does that, because that's what makes people really invest. The second thing I want to state is that I don't want to be anchored by the discussion from Arnold, but I want to say that the solution for Kenyan economic situation is not as complex as your president is trying to say, or your typical politician is trying to say, or how Boma is looking at it. The typical Kenyan problem is the following. We have two enemies, and we have two friends. The first enemy is the person who tells you that the current economic situation has been brought by Kenya Kwanza government. Our problems began all the way from 1992. We implanted all these things. Ruto is a president today because he was a youth for KANU 92. This problem was implanted by somebody a long time ago, and we are still going through that script. So we can't blame the Ruto government currently fully 100% for the issues which were there. There are so many players there. The second person who your enemy is anybody who has been in government and is telling you that now they have come with a strategy to solve it, but they're outside at the moment. Remember, Raila Odinga was a prime minister. At the same time, Kalonzo was a vice president to Kibaki, which means that outside William Ruto, these ones were the closest person inside government. What did they do? So if they come out and tell you now they have a magical formula to our problems, then you realize there's a problem there. Those are two enemies. What are your two friends? One, decency. Decency does not even call for legislation. Can parliament be parliament and executive be executive, judiciary be judiciary, electoral board, the media be the media, citizens be citizens? Decency, treating people with respect. Even if the law does not force you to do something, can you just do it decently? I'm sure, Zainab, you can go to a country and you have not read their constitution and you might not break the law because you are a decent person. Why must we always be talking about legal? Also, we have morality. We are taught in church, we are taught in school. Decency is lacking. The second thing, which I think is also our friend, if you can be able to ask me, is opportunity. Are we creating enough opportunities for people so that they can grow? So that's what my submission. So then the issue of the Kenyan revenue, which they have talked about in the Economic Council, let me state the following, that Kenyan problem has never been revenue. Kenyan problem is expenditure. And that's why what the budget controller says that we are budgeting for corruption means now that is expenditure. We are spending money on corruption. And let me talk about figures here. Since the president took office, he's borrowed 1.3 trillion. That's on record. He's collected 3.6 trillion shillings, making a total of money he has received since he became president, 4.9 trillion. Now, let's just look at what that can do. Expressway was around 24 billion. Thika Highway was around 26 billion. That makes 50. And then the SGR was 405 thereabout billion. Remember, if you add all those two things, you have not even reached 500 billion. If those are the biggest mega projects Kenya has ever done, does not reach 500 billion. So what can 4.9 trillion do for you? I think that's the question we have to ask. Where has that money gone? It has gone to what? Corruption. And also overspending and spending without prudence. So we need to solve that issue. The issue is not revenue, it's expenditure. So how can the controller of budget...
But where do you think the expenditure goes to? Isn't it servicing the debt that Kenya owes?
No. Let me tell you what, I've gone to court. Zainab, the official debt, according to Parliament appropriation, is 2.1 trillion. And I presented this in court. If you go to Treasury, the official debt is 6.1 trillion. But the Kenya Kwanza government says it's 9.1 trillion. Can those figures just be an error? It's not an error. So it is a scam. And I think that's why we are in court to make the Treasury come and tell us what our official debt.
Okay.
And actually, there's a lot of illegal debt there. So another thing, let me allow me to develop this point. So what I'm trying to say is that the issue of taxation, like I said, the issue of insatiable tax appetite. Tax is a tool. I'm an economist. Tax is a tool to do for you two things: either increase production or increase consumption. Because anytime someone is producing something, government makes money, but also economy grows, people get incomes and the rest. Anytime someone consumes, they also pay taxes. Any Kenyan who goes to bed on empty stomach has fasted your taxes. And I'm telling the president, money in the hands of a Kenyan is important. And that's why even development partners that were supporting the president are now starting to question, because I talked to them. They were thinking to partner with the president, so they want to trade with Kenya. So when you do a lot of taxation, you remove what's called the spending power of the middle class for people, so they cannot buy, for example, the thing they are supposed to buy. So I'm asking the president, overtaxing Kenyans will not grow the economy, and there are other ways to do that.
All right.
And let me just, I'm just finishing here by saying that the two elephants in the room in Bomas are two, which are not being tackled. The first thing, and he said, is the independence of the institution. It's not being discussed in Bomas. That is a big elephant in the room. Parliament knows very well they are not independent. The agenda they are discussing in Bomas have been given to them by the principals. So how, if the agenda has been set by the principals, you are discussing the agenda, it does not work. And I want to tell Maliba that by telling us that the president has nothing to do, the president is a party leader of UDA. He selected and gave the ticket to the members of parliament of his party. And he financed some of them. And I can tell you, sometimes a leader can finance people who are not so smart to be in some institutions deliberately so that they don't happen. Just like the cabinet is incompetent. This cabinet cannot be compared with Uhuru's cabinet, with Kibaki's cabinet. And if he wants delivery, because I said very well, Kibaki was sick physically, but mentally sound. He got right people to execute for him. Can the president just know that when you sit in cabinet and you see those people there in cabinet, if you become president, Zainab, can those people give you advice which can take you somewhere? So for me, I want to urge the president, those things of shuffling and changing people from which seat they are sitting, if the wrong people are in the bus, that bus is going nowhere, even if you change the sitting arrangement.
All right. All right. I know, Arnold, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, you actually asked about the insatiable appetite, and I just needed to say this very quickly, is that there are no new taxes included except for the housing levy. What is there is probably, we talk about VAT going up. A lot of these laws are actually very old ones. We either are just resurrecting what has been there before, and before we had this government, we were talking about everybody being able to actually lift their weight. And there should be tax justice. You know, when we talk about tax justice, is that people like you who are in formal employment are the people who shoulder the heaviest burden when it comes to paying taxes. Now, we are getting into places where literally everybody, and we have said this, since 1992, the informal sector became the biggest employer in this particular country. It overtook, in 1992, there's somebody in this particular panel probably who wasn't born in 1992. or was born around there. But I'm just telling you that the informal sector overtook the formal sector in 1992. But somehow we've remained with this informal sector, calling it the grey economy, and somehow we do not tax them. So the people in formal employment have continuously, and I give it to them, they're the people who are complaining online today, because the truth, even as we try to get everybody else, somehow some of these measures are sitting not very comfortable with them. So if you were to look at somebody talking about insatiable, we are implementing laws of the leaders you elected long time ago.
But what?
A little bit of them are new. I might not agree with some of the ways, like for example, what KRA is doing at the airports, for example.
And exactly,
I do not agree with that.
Right?
I do not agree with that.
But what are the biggest concerns? The biggest concerns are, even with the issue of taxes, Maliba, is the issue of, and this is what the experts had said, according to the standard, right? Unnecessary government expenditure. You have exaggerated budgeting, and then you also have now integrity issues, which then talks about the issue of corruption.
And that is why, let me first of all deal with the taxes. First of all, we are just, I think there's a little bit of pumped in energy on how to implement these laws. Some of these levies you realize they're as old. You know, when Michuki rules came in, a lot of us thought they were new rules. All of a sudden we were told these things were done in 80s, but some bodies had not worked on them. A number of these, what we call new taxes and levies, have actually been lying on papers elsewhere. There's a little bit of changes like on VAT. Of course, there's the housing levy, but a number of these things are not new. Actually, 99% of them are not new. Now, moving on expenditure part of it, which is for me is the biggest elephant in the room. Number one, that is a question as old as this country has always been. We have tackled it the same way we are tackling now, and it has not changed. I have said this. If we really want to have this particular conversation, and I quoted wrong numbers initially, we've got 900,000 public service. They consume 52% of our revenue. 52%. So, as we do that, are we willing to actually go the efficient way? Like, for example, do we really need to have these 900,000 people on permanent and pensionable scheme? It's unnecessarily expensive. Is it really like whatever we contribute, these people consuming 52% of the revenue, that really we see the service for that? Are we, where I sit, for example, I will tell you, I am not convinced that we see the value for the money we put in. A few people put their lives online. The people in the security sector, for example, they work so hard. The people in the teaching fraternity, the teachers, for example, if you look at what the teachers go through, they work so hard. I still feel like, for example, we will probably pay those two groups much more.
So perhaps an overhaul
but then,
of the economic
there is
policies.
need. That is the question. We need to rethink the public service the way it is.
Okay.
We cannot turn government into an employment bureau, make it so difficult to actually make these people productive, and also very impossible to send them home and then complain about the wage bill. That is where the biggest amount go.
All right, let's finish up on this.
Let's start there. Secondly, on consumption, let me just kill the consumption issue completely.
Kindly, Arnold, if you can.
The other bit of it, we talk about, I then raise the issue of allowance, leave alone the salaries, allowances. You know, the public service looks like it's a forest. I'll tell you, you could actually try to implement a policy, and then somewhere, somebody brings something called a circular. Done in a year, no one knows. It's somewhere, someplace that will always countermand a decision that is being made. So it becomes a very difficult place to operate. There are PSS who are being told by civil servants, ulitupata hapa na utatuacha hapa. As in, you can't do anything. So unless we rethink public service as is today, we are going to have this problem, because number one, that is the biggest place where we are spending money.
I want you to finish up on that, because this
and
is
then
a
now
topic.
The other corruption bit of it, we're talking about corruption.
This is a bit that I know we cannot
I will be a little bit cold on corruption.
Okay.
You see, there is a process on how you make porridge. This coffee here, there is a way it's made. If I took dust and took acid, it will not be coffee. So long as we continue to do the way we elect, the process will be the same. Why is it that we keep on bringing in newer people and we complain they are corrupt? There is a problem with the process of making those people. And that cannot be blamed on those people entirely. It should be blamed on the manufacturers. And no one wants to talk about that. The people we elect are a representative sample of who we are. So the next time we go to the ballot, can we also be bold enough and say, am I electing somebody that looks like me?
Okay, systemic issue. This issue of economy is something that we can never finish having a conversation around. I know, Bashir, you wanted to mention that, but time is running out.